Do you remember when the first person on your street installed solar panels on their roof? What a strange sight that was. Fast forward to today and how many panels are on the rooftops in your street now. Solar PV has been growing at an amazing rate throughout the world. Solar panels are now easy to spot both on rooftops for personal use and in large fields for utility scale plants in many parts of the world. But how much capacity is actually being installed and what part does it now play in the world's electricity generation? Worldwide, there is a little over 300 gigawatts of solar PV capacity installed, and the amount of energy produced was estimated to be about 1.5% of the total world electricity demand in 2016. Now, this number may seem small, and it is. But what's really exciting is how quickly solar PV has grown throughout the world to reach this number. If we look back to around 2007, when major growth in solar PV first began, the global installed capacity was less than 10 gigawatts. Solar PV was initially patented and commercialized in the United States of America way back in 1946. It was considered a niche market right up until the 1990s. Eventually, the value was seen in its ability to generate off-grid electricity. It was adopted most significantly by Japan and then Germany when the desire for low-emission generation had increased. An important factor in the growth of solar PV around 2007 was the implementation of various policy mechanisms to encourage the growth of renewable energies by a critical number of governments around the world. Some of the most prominent policy mechanisms were what are known as feed-in tariffs. Typically, feed-in tariffs are long-term contracts for renewable energy generators offering price certainty and a cost-based compensation structure, effectively subsidizing technologies such as rooftop solar PV and utility-scale solar farms. These supportive policies, along with continual cost improvements, combined to create a boom in solar PV installations. So, where is all this solar PV capacity, and how much does it actually contribute to the countries that have lots of installed capacity? Here is a diagram that shows estimates of the distribution of solar PV throughout the world at the end of 2016. Looking at the top 5, we can see China with 78.1 gigawatts, Japan with 42.8 gigawatts, Germany with 41.2 gigawatts, the USA of 40.3 gigawatts, and Italy with 19.3 gigawatts. Now let's look at what proportion of our electricity is generated by this solar PV. This diagram shows the percentage of electricity generated by solar PV in those countries with the most installations. In 2016, estimates show that solar PV in Italy generated the highest proportion at 7.3% of the total demand. Then Germany at 7%, Japan at 4.9%. China and the United States of America are interesting because despite having some of the highest installed capacity, the amount that solar PV contributed to the grid was only around the worldwide average at about 1.8%. This shows that when assessing these numbers, it is important to remember that each country has its own energy demands. For example, 2 other countries not mentioned are Honduras and Greece. Whilst their total solar PV capacities are relatively low, with 289 megawatts and 2.6 gigawatts respectively, they have managed to generate 12.5% and 7.4% of their electricity demand from solar PV. Now, let's look at solar PV in Australia. Since 2004, the total solar PV capacity of Australia has enjoyed an annual growth of almost 60%. The majority of the growth was spurred by implementation of various feed-in tariffs for homeowners and a subsidy scheme driven by a renewable energy target. Now, an estimated 16% of Australian households have their own solar PV system, the highest deployment of household solar PV systems in the world. The estimated installed solar PV capacity in Australia for 2016 was 5.9 gigawatts, with around 2.5% of our electricity being generated by solar PV technologies. Now we have an understanding of the solar PV capacity installed in the world today, as well as roughly how much of our electricity is actually generated by solar PV, and which countries have led the charge. Obviously, there is a long way to go, but if the historical growth rates can continue, it won't be long before solar PV generates a significant amount of the world's electricity. Odds are, these days, you aren't just seeing solar panels on your street, but you're seeing them on buildings and fields throughout your country. And I predict that you'll see even more evidence of solar PV in your environment as we move forward.